The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Y tonight for the final evening of Art Spaces and the Shape of the City. Following my introduction, our guests tonight, Robert Mayers and John Schiff, will briefly present some slides of their work, which will serve as a frame of reference for the ensuing conversation with moderator Paul Goldberger, the New York Times architecture critic. During the conversation on stage, you may write your questions on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. Ushers will come down the aisles, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guests tonight, Robert Mayers and John Schiff, are principals of the firm bearing their name, which they founded in 1968. Robert Mayers holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell and a master's from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He spent several years in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where he designed and supervised the construction of commercial, residential, health, and academic facilities sponsored by the United States Agency for International Development. He has served on the Mayor's Advisory Council for the architectural industry of the City of New York, and since 1974 has served as an adjunct professor of architecture at the Pratt Institute, and has lectured on architecture and urban design at Columbia and Cornell universities. John Schiff also received his degree in architecture from Cornell University. Before co-founding Mayers and Schiff, he managed a large architectural office for an American firm in Bangladesh, which produced several large-scale projects, including hospitals, hotels, and office buildings. He is a professor at the Cooper Union School of Architecture here in New York, and has served on the New York City Community Planning Board, for which he developed an analysis of the Times Square area. I believe that some of the discussion tonight will be about Times Square area. And his graphic work has received awards from the American Institute of Graphic Arts and from Print and Graphics magazines. Before we move on to our slide presentation tonight, I want to take a moment to thank Paul Goldberger for having moderated this series. His insightful questions and commentary, spiced by his dry wit, have made this series a favorite at the Y for several years. I was sitting in my office before and trying to figure how many people have actually attended this series, and I believe we're about up to 14,000 individuals at this point. His series has had a great impact, and we're grateful to Paul for his continued help in making these exciting evenings possible. We're honored that he comes back here each fall for this series of 5 Monday evenings, and I am now publicly urging him to start thinking about next season's Shape of the City. Please join me now in welcoming Paul Goldberger and our guests, Robert Mayers and John Schiff. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for those unusually nice words. I had, in fact, wanted to thank the members of the audience, some of whom I don't think there really have been 14,000 people seeing this series over 5.5 years. There may have been 300 of the same loyal people coming back again and again. And to the extent that those of you here tonight are among those 300, thank you for being here not only tonight, but all the preceding evenings. Those of you who are here for the first time, I hope you'll rejoin us if and when we pick up with a new group next fall. With that, let me welcome Bob Mayers and John Schiff, two architects who have worked around the world but have turned their attention in the last few years much more to certain problems in New York that will, I think, form the focus of our discussion tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. We've selected some slides for tonight. It's mostly centered around Times Square and our work in that area because of the theme of the program, Art Spaces and the Shape of the City. And we've been doing some recent work in Times Square. And then we have a sprinkling of some other projects, both past and present. We can put the lights down, please. Thank you. Can you focus the slide on the left here, please? On the right, you see the the leaders of our office. John and I, incidentally, have been together for, it's going to be 20 years in April since we started our firm. We started working together as students at Cornell University many years ago. And the staff around us are our other partner, Patrick Curley, and associates, Pat Golden and George Sendiach. Starting right at the Times Square, you can see on the right the tickets booth that we designed many years ago. It was a temporary structure supposed to be up for about a year. And unfortunately, we didn't get our fee in a commission on the number of tickets that were sold because it's still there. As you know, when Mayor Lindsay was mayor, there were many attempts made to clean up Times Square. And this was one of the few projects that actually got off the ground in Times Square. And when Mayor Lindsay was leaving office, the Office of Midtown Planning decided to have a going-away party for him, and they asked for a blow-up of that photograph on the right of the tickets booth, which we did. We had it blown up and mounted and sent it over. And they called us back a few minutes later and said, there's a terrible problem here. How can we show this to Mayor Lindsay, who's been trying to clean up Times Square, when you have this man over here lying on the ground? So we sent it out again and had it airbrushed. Unfortunately, I don't have that version of the slide, but that was actually, I think, the major accomplishment in cleaning up Times Square at the time. The whole booth was supposed to be temporary, so it's all rented. The scaffolding around it is rented from a firm that puts that up around buildings that are going to be demolished. It was going to be held down by pile driving test weights, which were eventually became concrete weights. And John and I designed the logo, and we had a lot of fun with this. I have to press the right buttons here. Some of you may remember the proposal for Broadway Plaza. The idea was to close Broadway between 44th and 50th Streets and create a mall. And there was going to be a plaza here between 46th and 47th Streets. As part of that, we designed a permanent tickets booth, which you see on the right. Of course, it was never built because Broadway Plaza was never built. This was to house both the tickets booth and the New York Information Center and the Army Recruiting Center, all in one structure. So obviously, out-of-town tourists had to be very careful about what door they entered in this particular structure. A piece of that tickets booth you can see over on the right, which was eventually put up in Fulton Mall. These are very sort of ad hoc structures, and this one tries to reflect the area around it. In the facade, it's made out of subway siding, stainless steel subway siding, and backlighted logo on the top. The other one is the music and dance booth, which now stands in Bryant Park behind the public library. Further to the south, in Times Square, we were responsible for Theater Row Phase 2, which is between 9th and 10th Avenue. We did the paving, the landscaping of the sidewalk, and the Clark Center and the Douglas Fairbanks Theater. This is now the John Houseman Theater on the left. On the right, you see the Douglas Fairbanks Theater, which is an off-Broadway theater on 42nd Street. We all associate with Times Square the great lights and collage of the super signs. On the right is a slide from 1923 of the Great White Way, and on the left is a more recent one taken from the Times Tower looking north. And as a lot of these sites became soft sites subject to development, the city began to worry about how can we preserve the life and the excitement of Times Square and clean up the area, have new buildings, but still have that special quality that makes this a great outdoor space for New York. And indeed, it is the major tourist attraction of the city. Well, we have had a project where we worked for the New York City Public Development Corporation, studying Times Square and coming up with proposals so that the signage, lighting, etc., could be retained regardless of what the development is. On the left, you see a study that we did which shows the placement of signage on new buildings that go up in the area. And any buildings that front on Broadway and 7th Avenue between 43rd and 50th Street, in fact, now are required to have a certain amount of super signage in the lower levels that cover the facades so that that feeling of Times Square can be retained. And on the right, you see a model study where we were studying at the time setbacks in the new structures and then super signs being placed on those setbacks at angles to the space. We also looked at the possibilities of putting signage over the rights of way. This was not enacted into zoning, but on the left you see a possibility, we call it a pylon, and this was around the Times Square area, around this outdoor room, putting up a steel superstructure where the city would rent out space for lighted signage. On the right is a less intrusive one, which is on a single pylon, much like the signs that you see along highways, which would have lighted signage protruding out over the right-of-way. We thought this would be a good way for the city to earn income and to still retain the super signage in the event that they could not enact into zoning the requirement that new structures that developers put up have super signage on them. We also looked at paving and lighting. We did a complete paving plan for Times Square and for 42nd Street. On the left, you see a small part of it, which called for certain regular paving of granite pavers and a contrasting curb. And then in the areas here in front of new buildings, the developer would have a palette that they could select from and put in their own patterns of paving. On the right, you see a light fixture that we worked on with Paul Morant's lighting designer. And this is for the Times Square space. It's a light fixture for the street that has 4 heads instead of 1 of a multicolored light that when mixed will create a white light. And you can see the placement of those up and down Times Square. Finally, on the right, you see an artist's rendition of what 42nd Street might look like if some of these zoning requirements were enacted. It calls for point source lighting to be installed on the facades of buildings so that there would be actual visible light sources on the facades, and a certain amount of signage required for theaters and advertising on the facades. And on the left is sort of a romantic model that we made at the time, which shows the Times Square area and the Times Tower. And we were thinking at the time, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Times Tower had a friend to the north over here, and they could have some sort of dialogue between them with lasers, lights, sound, signage, etc. Little did we know at the time that we would eventually be commissioned to design a building for that very spot. Can you focus the slide on the right, please? This is a speculative office building for the site that is now occupied by the Coca-Cola sign on the corner of 47th Street to 48th Street between 7th Avenue and Broadway. And we are now in the schematic design phase of this building. The building itself is a sign. It's a pylon that faces south with super signage facing Times Square. And then on its Broadway facade, the side is notched with super signs stepping up the facade so that they can actually be seen from Times Square. On the top of the building would be another super sign with lasers and animated lighting. Now from Times Square into the subways. Can you focus the slide on the left, please? Several years ago, John and I did a series of posters for the Museum of Natural History to appear in the subway. These were mythological monsters made out of modular pieces. And they were all supposedly dinosaurs less well known. This is the Thesaurus Rex, which has a vocabulary of 1,000 words. Actually, the museum started getting phone calls asking where this could be seen. Several of these were placed in the subway at the time, in the subway station at 81st Street. Several years later, and more recently, we have now done several subway stations for the city. On the right, you see the Hoyt Street subway station in Brooklyn. We've also done the Borough Hall subway station. These renovations typically cost about $3 million. They include new paving, new lighting, new signage, benches, walls, etc. We've also been doing several retail projects, one for Aetna Life and Casualty Company, and we've done 26 stores for IBM throughout the Northeast. Our office also does a great deal of office interior work. On the left is a project for Drexel Burnham Lambay Brokerage House. On the right is an adaptive reuse of 2 townhouses in New York for an insurance company. We've done the international headquarters for Ernst & Winnie on 9 floors of the Equitable Building on 7th Avenue. And finally, totally unrelated to these other projects, but more bringing us back to Paul Goldberger, these are 2 residential projects that we did a number of years ago, and that Paul wrote some very nice articles about. One is on the right is a house for East Hampton. On the left is a modern addition to a Victorian house. And actually, I just was reminded that the last time I showed this slide at a gathering was when John and I were presenting at a meeting of artists and architects, and we were trying to figure out how do you show these slides. And so John showed the house, and then he showed eventually the addition. How do you add a modern addition onto a Victorian house? And then he sat down. He said, "Now Bob is going to present his slides." And I got up and I said, "Well, our office is very busy now. We don't see each other much, and I have my own slides and my own projects that I'm working on." And when I showed this slide, I said, well, this couple came to us. I started with the Victorian house, with the addition here. And I said, they came to us and they had this hideous addition on this Victorian house and asked us to restore the house. And I went backwards and eventually ended up with the Victorian house. We do work at cross purposes sometimes. Thank you.
Someday there will be a smooth way for this furniture to appear magically, and sort of like as the screen rises, the furniture will descend and everything will be perfect. I loved your story about the photo with the vagrant in Times Square and Mayor Lindsay's complaint about it, and you're airbrushing it out. It actually occurred to me as you were showing us that that's sort of what Mayor Koch is actually trying to do literally right now with them. He must have been inspired in some way by that photograph. I'd like to talk first about Times Square in general, before we talk more specifically about some of the projects. It seems to me interesting that today we have come to think of Times Square itself as a kind of art space. I mean, given that we've chosen that as a theme for this series this year, and you were asked, not because you've designed a museum, but because you've done so much work about the problem of Times Square as a civic space, and that we've really come culturally to consider it a kind of art space in and of itself. What does that say about this culture at this moment, do you think, that we would have that attitude toward Times Square, which after all was created initially as a rather ad hoc advertising vehicle itself? I mean, it was not a consciously created public room in the way that a great piazza might have been. It kind of happened.
Well, Times Square is obviously about commerce and competition. And one of the most exciting parts of it right now, if you look at the signage, is between 46th and 47th on the west side, where the signs are all crashing against each other and competing for the angle of vision. And one of the difficulties that we had was in looking at Times Square as a, quote, cultural space. What is the culture? And if the culture is one of competition and collage and commerce, you don't want to make it like a mall in Minneapolis.
Right.
And so we were very
Exactly.
careful in our proposals to the city, for instance, for the paving, that there would be some unifying element, but there would be great areas where individual builders could put their own pattern, make their own mark.
It cannot be genteel. Whatever else it is, it can't be that. Right?
Well, there were proposals, when we were doing the study, there were discussions about increasing the width of the sidewalks
Right.
and making the space more comfortable. And frankly, our opinion was that the space shouldn't necessarily be very comfortable, that it should be a space that perhaps even is a little bit threatening. When you look at Times Square and you draw a circle, you'll find that within perhaps less than 1,000 feet, you'll find Rockefeller Center, which is a space which is choreographed and very comfortable and perhaps very secure and safe. You can go another few feet.
Right.
And when I say few, again, within 1,000 feet perhaps of Times Square, you can come to Bryant Park. Again, this is what makes New York so rich, is that within 1,000 feet, you can have three spaces of places, Rockefeller Center, Bryant Park, and Times Square, all coexisting, but all providing a different quality for the user. And I think the quality of Times Square is one that you don't want to overly clean up. I mean, it was funny to see the bum lying there, but that's what makes it unique and rich. And the advertising also doesn't want to be choreographed. You don't want to control that. You want the marketplace to control that. You want the advertising to compete with one another and not necessarily all work together in a harmonious kind of blending, but you want that sense of competition, that sense of chaos, which makes it very rich and I think very unique and appealing.
I agree with all that in principle, John, but on the other hand, if the marketplace were really to take its natural course, today there really wouldn't be much advertising left on Times Square. I mean, the whole idea of the zoning studies that you've done and that the city has done are an attempt to preserve what, by the natural forces of the marketplace, no longer exist, I think.
I'm not convinced. Well, in our building, for example, the advertising throws up extraordinary revenue. And I'm not sure, I don't know much about the other buildings, and the problem there is the user, the
Right.
large-scale corporate user is
Exactly.
offended by the advertising.
I mean, there was
so
a
that
bitter fight over the building Gwathmey's doing that at one point Morgan Stanley was going to go into, and the idea of advertising was repulsive to them and to several of the potential corporate tenants and developers at Times Square. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, I mean, one of the problems we're facing is that in some ways Times Square is being killed by what is saving it. I mean, it is the very forces that are cleaning it up in one sense and bringing prosperity to that part of town are also turning it into something as sterile as 6th Avenue. And left to their own devices, most developers would not be inclined to put signs on their buildings. Your own situation is different, I think, because your developer is unusual and your site is unusual because it's that narrow little triangle at the north end. But the sites that have now been cleared on the side of Times Square, I don't think would have much advertising, and were the city not requiring it as a new zoning package. So I guess my question, to come around the long way, is there not something a little bit artificial about mandating by zoning what just kind of happened by itself 50 years ago?
There's a dilemma. The city, on the one hand, wanted to encourage development, so they
Right.
changed the FAR, the floor area ratio that a builder can build, from 15 to 18, encouraging development. At the same time, they acknowledge the fact that this is an area which has a uniqueness, tremendous tourist attraction. And how do those two things work together? In the case of a hotel, it's less complicated,
Right.
because the lower floors of a hotel can be ballrooms; they don't need windows. But there's a dichotomy. There's a problem in the mix there.
Right.
I don't know if it'll be artificial. Time will tell. Our particular building, granted, is a different situation because you don't have the large floor area that a big scale, a law firm or accounting firm would move into a building like that. You're going to be dealing with smaller scale users. I really can't answer the question as to whether or not it'll be artificial. I do know that there's a great deal of dollars thrown off by the signs.
Right.
What will happen, I don't know. But we felt strongly that this should not be turned into a homogenized plastic space which is devoid of signs and the scale of the buildings without any setbacks.
Well, I mean, you could well argue that it's artificial, but so what? That an artificial Times Square is better than a real Third Avenue.
Well,
I mean, that would be a perfectly fair response to concede that it's artificial and then say, so what of it?
Well, I think that the fact that signs will be there,
right,
and which goes against possibly the economics, the current day economics, is artificial.
Right.
But once the signs are there, they won't be artificial. No one will know that they are there. They will be producing dollars, and they will be competing with each other, and they'll be very lively.
They obviously do produce dollars, although I wonder, again, and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, how much they do fit into the natural economics of advertising. I mean, you who've looked at Times Square more carefully than anyone else obviously know that most of the signs these days carry Japanese names.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Well, they're there to sort of increase brand identification in this country more than anything more specific.
Well, studies have been done about that. American advertising companies like to put advertising in places where they can measure what the effect will be, that they can see how many people watch this show or
read this magazine.
Yeah, read this magazine.
Right.
You can't tell how many people walk past here and see that. The Japanese companies, evidently, these decisions are made on the topmost level, the chairman of the board of the Japanese companies, and they like these because it's also an ego builder for their company. A lot of American movies are made in Times Square every year. I just saw one the other day.
Right.
And so the Japanese like this, that when an American movie comes to Japan or anywhere in the world, they see their sign up in the background. So.
Right. Well, it's kind of like, I guess, the way, I mean, on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, there are all these billboards for all the new movies, and apparently it's sort of an ego thing with the Hollywood studios. You have to have a billboard there, even though economically it doesn't necessarily have that much of effect on anything else. So, but is that going to be sustainable, really?
Well, as long as the space is there, the signs will be rented. If you look back at 1974, though, when there was a slowdown in economics in New York, a lot of those signs were blank.
Right.
And they were hiring artists to paint the signs. So we might have some very nice artwork, too.
Right.
If the market goes down a little bit more.
There's been an enormous change in the technology of signage, hasn't there, in the last few years, too? I mean,
actually, looking back historically, I mean, we looked at slides of Times Square dating back to the turn of the century, and frankly, there were periods of time long ago when it was much more exciting than it is today. And today, you do have tremendous technology. So the hope is that with the new development and with the incorporation of some of the new technology, the signs will be more exciting, the animation will be richer, and what they can do with signs will make the space even more exciting. So obviously in Tokyo and some other cities where we did look at precedents, that there are some extraordinary things you can do.
Right.
This is like anything else, Paul. This is a space that belongs to the city, and it has a unique character. And it would be nice to keep it.
No, I'm all for that, obviously. I'm just wondering again whether we don't, to some extent, romanticize it, knowing it's not really as central to our lives as I think it was a generation or two ago, when the idea of public open space was much more important in our culture. I think it's tragic that it's not as important, so I'm not sympathetic to the change, I'm just acknowledging it. I mean, the way people gathered there to celebrate VJ Day or VE Day, whatever, all those famous pictures of people spontaneously rushing to Times Square, they don't do that anymore. I mean, it's true they come New Year's Eve, but that's about it. It no longer holds the allure of a central gathering space, of a town square for the world, if not for the city, as it once did. Do you think that's attainable ever again in an age of television and
well, it
a
may
different
not,
way of living?
It may not be a space that people come to gather in, but the New York City Information Bureau tells us that it's the main tourist attraction in New York City today.
Really?
Yeah. So people are gathering there, but they're just gathering, every day.
You don't think today they're a little bit disappointed when they come from
today they
wherever?
And there are a lot of holes in the ground.
A lot of holes in the ground,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I had never seen, I don't think, your idea, which I find fascinating, of pylons around the square, which would carry advertising over the public streets and sidewalks. I find that fascinating not only because of its ability to do a neat end run around the problem of putting advertising on commercial office buildings, but also in the way it would further enclose and define the space. Because Times Square has always been somewhat ambiguous as a space. I mean, it is a space, but it's also just two wide streets converging, and it would give it more of a centrifugal sense, I think. Can you talk a little bit more about that whole idea and where it came from and what happened to it?
Well, you're right, and Bob mentioned this. I mean, our first notion was that we were very concerned that the city would not develop guidelines or actually regulations requiring developers to put the sign. So we were afraid that we'd lose that, and we were looking for a way where we could actually use open space that the city didn't have to look to another party to get the sign. So the pylon really was a fallback position. But the concern again is in the city of New York, there's something very strong about the grid system and how the streets go all the way through, and the issue of blocking that street at Times Square. It reinforced the urban room, but at the same time it began to compromise some of the reading of the street going through. And so there was a lot of study. Bob showed a pylon that spanned the street, and then he showed one that was an individual pylon that was on one side of the street. We were fascinated by it. Threw off a lot of income for the city, but it was obviously also very, very controversial. And it's really, I don't think that it's going to happen, but it's something that we just explored early on in the project.
So it has, at this point, no real future.
The city was not very enthusiastic about it.
Right.
They were more enthusiastic about our proposals for the amount of signage to be required on buildings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And those were instrumental in the current zoning, which has now been adopted.
They were considered. The city, of course, wrote their own zoning.
Your ideas contributed to what has in fact become law. Right.
We also took into consideration, a slide I didn't show you, we studied the angles of view of the signs and the fact that you can see signs higher up as you get further away.
Right.
And we had suggested a zone that would increase in height towards the north and the south. They did not adapt that, but they do count signs at the north and south end above a certain height towards the total that you need.
Right. I also liked your slide that showed a number of three-dimensional signs. I mean, the Tylenol sign as an actual object, as opposed to just a two-dimensional billboard. I mean, that seems to recall the great days of the old signage a little more.
Well, the way, I mean, one of the things you do is in a situation where it's an open marketplace, the signs that have survived, the ones that are successful, are the ones that can be most easily seen.
Right.
A sign that's actually facing north has a greater value because of the traffic direction. Cars are moving down. Well, the ones that are, for example, on the Times Tower have a great value because cars are moving south and facing those signs.
Right.
The signs are always rotated, not necessarily in a rational way that you can mathematically compute, but it's all based on the ability to see the sign. So that rotated sign system that we were exploring there really had to do with, again, giving the advertiser an opportunity to have the most people see his product on a sign.
You see, on our building, we proposed, actually we had a Coca-Cola, half of a Coca-Cola
Right,
can.
I remember that.
When our attorney saw it, he said, you can't use the name Coca-Cola on your building. You don't have their approval. So we changed it. We airbrushed it. We changed it to Cola Soda. I don't know if you noticed.
Yeah, I remember.
So we were proposing three-dimensional signs, too. And the final design of the sign, though, is not up to the architect. It's up to the advertising agency and the advertiser. So we're just giving a framework. We're saying what size they should be, where they should go, and providing the electrical outlets, et cetera, for them. And hopefully they'll be very imaginative in what they put on these buildings.
Right, great. One thing we have not talked about is the public or quasi-public project for Times Square, the UDC City Public Development Corporation project for the south end around 42nd Street with the 4 Philip Johnson and John Berge towers. What is your sense of it as two architects who've been as involved in Times Square as any, but are not involved in that particular project? Can you say a word about that?
Well, from the beginning, it was, obviously a very controversial project.
Right.
There's architecturally is a scale problem from our point of view. These are enormous buildings, and
right.
all the study models that we did when you put these buildings into the project, and if you go to the site and you try to imagine the scale of those things, perhaps 2 or 3 times the height of the Times Tower, it always presented a problem, not to mention the fact that the issue relative to signs, these buildings were produced before any of these
right.
signage regulations.
Right.
So it was always a problem. But for us, it was a given when we started our study. It wasn't a matter of addressing those particular buildings. When we were hired to do our study,
right.
those buildings were a fact of life, along with several other projects. I think the merchandising mart on the corner of 8th Avenue and 42nd Street as well. But they are, and I don't even know what the status of those buildings would be today.
Still uncertain.
But architecturally, it was
neither dead nor alive, I think.
They're buildings that seem to us
status.
to belong on perhaps Park Avenue or Madison Avenue that were lifted and placed on Times Square.
Their scale is such that I'm not sure they would fit too naturally there either.
Well, just the notion of a granite and glass
right.
building,
Right.
It just seemed, in my mind, transported from another place.
Well, my greatest concern about Times Square now is not the issue of signage or the spirit of Times Square at all, but in fact whether the scale of the new Times Square will make all these gestures irrelevant. You can do every possible right thing in the world in terms of signs and zoning and this and that, but if you put 6 or 8 million square feet of office space there, 4 million in this project and a great deal in the other projects, doesn't any of it much matter, really.
Well, there's 2 issues. One is day and one is night. And
right.
at night, if the buildings are dark, they dematerialize and the signs light up, and you wouldn't really know how tall those buildings are.
Yeah.
And one of our recommendations was that they do not allow any exterior lighting of buildings in the Times Square area, that the signs provide the light.
Right.
So that we won't be looking at 50-story high facades.
Right. Or at least not floodlighting.
Yeah, no floodlighting.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Exactly. What is happening with your Duffy Square project? The one you showed us, the building at the north end of Times Square. That is now sure to go ahead, or?
Well, we're in the design phase of that, and the developer for that never wanted to be the first building in Times Square.
Right.
He's a little more cautious. He wanted to be like number 4.
Right.
And you see other buildings going up, so I think we'll be number 4 probably.
Right, and he's doing it, okay.
Well, the reason that developer, you see so many buildings ripped down is in fact that they have to have their foundations built
right.
by May of '88.
Right.
So everyone is rushing to
qualify under the zoning.
To get
sure.
a maximum size. Our building isn't necessarily affected by that, so there's not this great rush.
Okay.
To
right.
move
So he
ahead.
can afford to take his time.
Because as you get closer to the top of the building, the floors get smaller, and we are starting with such a small floor to begin with. There would not be economical floors to put up there anyway.
Right. Well, good. I'm going to pause for a moment to remind everyone that this is a good time to jot down questions, profound and otherwise, on Times Square or any other relevant matter, and ushers will circulate the next couple of minutes and pick up cards that you wave. Let me switch to one of the other things you showed us something about, which was subway stations. It seemed like you have made some very tentative gestures toward making them kind of cultural spaces in a way. Can you talk a little more about that?
I can tell you that we tend, when we get a project in the office, we tend to look at it in any number of ways. And I remember the subway station that we first got was Borough Hall. It's a landmark station in Brooklyn. And we knew what the construction budget was, and Bob mentioned about $3 million. And our first approach was to say to put the $3 million in the bank and let it generate 8% interest or $250,000 a year, and we'll hire out-of-work actors and have them serve cappuccino every morning and forget about trying to fix it up because it costs about $300 to move a tile down, a flight of stairs, and install it. So
that's very smart, actually.
We thought that would be wonderful, but the Transit Authority didn't respond very positively to it. Anyway, but our tendency is to...
Cappuccino, I just want to point out that they have a list of approved materials.
Right,
and
cappuccino was
not on the list.
Right, exactly.
We looked under C, but it was...
But the station, that particular station, when you talk about it, had a terrific history. It was one of the earliest, I think it was the first station in Brooklyn. And so that after that first idea went by the boards, that we were involved really in restoring a landmark station, which is still under construction because it's going to be a second landmark by the time this contractor finishes.
The contractor is going to be landmarked eventually.
Well, the process of subway station reconstruction is beyond anything I have ever seen. I know that 42nd Street and 8th Avenue, which is near my office, has been under reconstruction for most of my memory. It is still not finished. It is still not anywhere close to finished. I have never seen anyone at work in it. It's kind of like this sort of strange, ghostly thing where every few months you notice there's about 2 more feet of white tile that looks like it came from an airport concourse that has sort of been there. I think actually the whole thing was underwritten not by the Transit Authority but by the Airport Authority to make the airports appear more lovable and humane and wonderful.
By the time you get there.
Right, but it just nothing ever happens there. Right.
Well, the Borough Hall station is a landmark station, and we called for a certain amount of the glass tile, which is very hard to get now, to be removed from a certain part of the station and placed in another area. And the first day, 2 workmen showed up with large hammers, started smashing the glass tile.
Oh.
And you're dealing with the lowest bid in a publicly bid project. And I don't even know whether some of these contractors ever visited the site. They get the job and then they're let loose. Right. And it's very difficult because the law requires you to give it to the lowest bidder in a public bidding. Right. So it puts a lot of responsibility on the Transit Authority and on the architect to watch what they're doing and try to get them to do it right.
Right, right. Is it doable at all? I mean,
well, you can see some of the stations.
Yeah, I mean, some of them
nice.
are decent, actually. I mean, but the cost per square foot must be staggering, no?
Yeah, it's very expensive, but I think that it is possible to use. Actually, it's an interesting project.
Yeah.
I mean, from an architect standpoint, you're dealing with this fantastic extruded linear space, and there's a lot to work with architecturally. But the bureaucratic end of it, I mean, when you present to the Transit Authority, I think there are 25 different sub-agencies, and so each person within the Transit Authority is requesting something that will satisfy their own personal needs, whether it be maintenance or lighting or whatever. So it's a difficult client, but ultimately I think architecturally it's a challenging space to work with, and there have been successful ones.
What do you think are the best? Either your own or anyone else's, it doesn't matter.
Well, I think that there are aspects of spaces that are successful. I think the one at Fifth Avenue has certain aspects that are interesting. I haven't seen it completed yet, but the one that's near the Museum of
Modern Art?
The Pomeroy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I was at the Fulton Street one today, which is nice. That's coming along.
Fulton.
The last 10 years.
On which line?
Lee also did that.
IRT, Lexington Avenue.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's
line.
been going on since the beginning.
Yeah, they all.
They put the light bulbs in.
That's a major accomplishment.
Well, the fixtures were there for 2 years, and you can begin to see that it's going to be nice.
Right.
So that's why the subway poster project was a little more interesting, because you do that in an hour,
Right.
and the other thing takes 10 years. So the rewards from graphics are quite different than the rewards.
Do you do a lot of graphics in your office?
Well, we've always been interested in that, and I think the tickets booth actually was the initial interest in it, because the client had no identification and we did the logo. But periodically we've been called upon to do things that have a graphic component. Stores, Aetna and the IBM stores, and the sign that Bob had showed outside Theater Row, a highway sign. So
So you did all of that in-house?
Yeah.
That came from your office, right?
So there is an interest, and we think it's important.
Some of these things, though, Paul, you see that sign in front of theater, or that red sign?
Yeah, right, I
post.
remember that, sure.
And you look at it and say, that's interesting. It's a highway sign in New York. And that sign took about 1.5 years to get done, because we originally had the post going down in the sidewalk and the sign cantilevering out towards the facade. And we found out that anything that pierces the sidewalk falls under the Department of Franchises. And that takes your life to get the approval for that. So then we decided to put the post behind the property line and cantilever out the other way.
If you promised to wire Brooklyn for cable TV, you could put your sign on 42nd Street, probably.
But I was going to say, then we put the pole behind the property line and cantilevered out over the sidewalk. We found out that had to be a marquee. That fell under an advertising sign, which was illegal. So the only legal way to make it was to make it into a marquee. And a marquee has to protect people. It has to have some sort of horizontal surface. If you go to that site and look very carefully, you will find a 2-foot wide horizontal surface under the sign.
As long as the rain is falling absolutely vertically, you could be protected.
You're totally protected in a case like that.
The noble marquee.
We were even willing to make a contribution to this cable TV to get that thing approved.
Don't say that. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned the tickets booth, because I was about to ask you a little more about that.
Sure.
It always seemed to me one of the reasons it was so successful was that it had this sort of almost magical balance between feeling temporary and like a sort of energetic little tent set up there on Times Square and spontaneous, and yet solid enough to not really appear to blow away in a strong wind. And so the sort of sense of spontaneity, which has really been the critical issue at Times Square, that it once appeared to have, that it no longer does have, seems somehow to be restored by that building, in a way.
That building was spontaneous. It was done for $5,000 construction budget. And
What year was it again?
I don't know.
Just around 1970, maybe a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think so. And we were told that they had a capital budget. They had no capital budget, but they had an operating budget. And we didn't know what that meant. And we said, what is an operating budget? They said, well, that pays for maintenance and rentals, and we have no capital budget. So we said, if we rent things, we can do it. They said, yeah. So the trailer was rented and the pipes were rented. Turns out in the long run, they should have bought it because they had it.
Are they still renting them 15 years
I think they eventually
later?
paid it off and bought it. I hope so.
I'm going to interrupt to remind you all again to waive questions and hope that somebody can appear and collect them, since I saw people diligently writing them. So if you have any, hold them up, and a member of the wise, vast, and efficient staff will walk down the aisles. One of the slides showed the tickets booth in black and another in red. Was it once? I don't now remember. Was it originally black and then became red?
Mm-hmm.
What was the story there?
I don't think there's a story.
It had to do with a change of color.
I thought you were going to say change of administration or something. No, change of color, okay.
They wanted to redo the panels, and
Right.
We felt it should
Time
be
for it, right.
time for a change.
Are you going to do a new color for the next decade, or?
I don't think so. I really, right now the issue that they're having is that they want to protect the line, the people that stand on line there.
Mm-hmm.
And they're pursuing ways of covering it over. We're not actually involved in that right now because there's a lot of stuff underneath, and it's very hard to put foundations. The whole Times Square area is hollow underneath the subways.
Right.
But I don't think that they have a budget right now to do anything
And
further.
I think that we had suggested just handing out
Oh, yeah,
umbrellas.
that was another-
our solution to that problem.
I like
And even
that,
if people
actually,
took
yeah.
them, it would not be any more expensive.
I like your de-architectural solutions to architectural problems. Actually,
We spent
You
so
were among
many
the-
years trying to get business, and now we're trying to put ourselves out of business. Umbrellas
you're
and
at least
things
among
like
the very few people,
cappuccinos.
you're among the very few people to admit that some architectural problems are best give a non-architectural solution.
Well, there are problems. The client comes very often, and it's a problem. It's not always just purely an architectural problem. The tickets booth problem was that they had no money. They had a trailer. They were actually, I think the trailer was donated. And they said, paint, paint something on the side of it. That was the problem, and it wasn't necessarily an architectural problem. And it became a problem that it would be lost. No one would see it.
Right.
And that's when we got into this capital budget versus, we didn't know anything about it, as Bob said.
Mm-hmm.
But we learned about it. And,
right.
So the problem as it comes to us isn't always purely an architectural problem.
Right.
And it's actually fascinating to look at it from different points of view.
Do you have any regret that the Times Square Mall didn't happen, the pedestrian mall?
Well, we had obviously a selfish interest in that project because we were very interested in doing the new tickets booth. But in retrospect, no, I have no.
You didn't design the mall itself,
no,
though, just the new booth for it, right?
And it was all associated with the hotel, and there were other issues which were very controversial at the time. But in retrospect, I don't necessarily feel that there's a great loss there. Right.
Yeah, my sense is it's a rather little mourned project. I mean, even among people who are not great advocates of increasing the accessibility of the automobile in Manhattan, nonetheless somehow don't feel there was any great mistake made in leaving that street open.
There's something about the kind of strength of Broadway as it slices through the city, and then taking a little piece of it and sort of cutting it off is questionable, really.
No, it seems so to me too, actually. And giving more prominence to the Marriott could not have helped very much either, I suppose.
The Marriott was actually one of the stimulating influences on our study of signage, because we were looking at that building as what shouldn't be done.
Right.
In Times Square.
Well,
those blank concrete walls.
Right. And the single sign, they have one at the scale is, this.
Well, that one single sign exists only because John Portman was put under great pressure by the city, and it would not even have been that.
Yeah, but putting that aside, you look at that block, and then you look at the block to the north, and there's quite a difference in terms of one really feels the sense of competition, the richness, the collage, the competition between the signs, and then this bland mall type sign.
Right. Oh, of course, terrible.
So the regulations require a minimum number of signs. They tell you for each facade you have to have a certain number.
And there has to be movement in the signs, right? I mean, not that huge. It's the static quality of that Marriott sign, I think, that's part of the problem. It's interesting because I don't think there's been a truly memorable sign in the last generation on Times Square. If you talk to people about Times Square signs, I think they'll still tell you the camel sign and the smoke rings, which hasn't even been there in 20 years, I guess.
Most people who remember that have never actually seen that sign.
But that's just it. I mean, that it could get such incredible iconographic status that it really became a little icon of American culture in a way. Even though you're right, many people never saw it who remember it. But nothing since then or who claim to remember it or who talk about it. But nothing since then has really been remembered or been considered as important. Has it?
No, there's certainly the potential to make signs that are certainly equal, if not more exciting than that, is there. It's just a matter of...
Be careful with those questions, Paul. I saw my wife hand one in.
Okay, tell me something about her handwriting, and I will try to be on guard. We preserve the tradition of anonymity in this series, but we're going to... here's one that picks up right from the question of the tickets booth. Have you considered doing designs for Local Law 10 scaffolding? Oh, I like that.
I'll pass on that one, Bob. You can handle that.
We haven't done anything for Local Law 10, and we haven't considered it. However, part of the, it's interesting, that's a good question, because part of the study that we did for the Public Development Corporation was to suggest designs of scaffolding that would go around the empty construction sites when that UDC project goes ahead. And we did propose ways of mounting signage so that there would be signage, even advertising signage, even around the empty construction sites. So I guess we have done it.
Right. Good. That's a number of interesting. Let's stick for another moment or two to Times Square before we go on. These questions actually vary far afield. Don't you feel that the absolute reliance on a gratuitous, temporary, essentially schlock media images fails to provide a sound, physical basis for a dynamic urban space? It's one of those questions which sort of about beating your wife. I mean, what can you say? It would seem that the dynamism of Times Square derives from the overlapping of varied realms of activity: theaters, bankers, commuters, pimps, prostitutes, and consumers. And to place a facile Venturism merely masks what is becoming a homogeneous area because of a similarity of activity, regardless of what color the neon is. It's actually an eloquent question once we...
Quite a question.
Once we get beyond the initial sentence.
Try to figure out what the question was.
I think
something about pimps.
No, but it's a fair question, in fact. Actually, it's basically... what the questioner is actually saying, I think, is thoughtful. Is the real issue of Times Square not the enormous overlapping of various realms or spheres of activity that was traditionally the case there, rather than the actual specific design of the neon and the signs and so forth, which are just a very minor commercial slice of the broader life that once existed there?
It's true. We didn't talk about the other aspects of what the zoning requires and what Times Square is about. Obviously, if nothing were done and there were no regulations, everything would be torn down and there would be office buildings and we'd have Park Avenue or Madison Avenue there. So this is an attempt to keep some of the character of it. Now, there is a requirement in the zoning that 5% of the floor area has to be devoted to theater-related, entertainment-related uses, which could be costume makers and rehearsal studios, etc. In all the new office buildings, all the new structures that go up in that area, there's an attempt to keep that mix. There's a requirement that at the ground floor, there's continuous retail, and that no store can be wider than 40 feet, no one store. So there won't be a department store. There can't be travel agencies and airline ticket offices. So there is an attempt to keep a mix there.
Right.
But how much can you legislate that? There's an attempt to keep the theaters on the side streets, obviously.
There are a couple of other questions that are actually quite similar, but let me read them to you in case they prompt just some further thoughts in the same direction. One asks you if you could elaborate some more on specific spatial considerations to reinforce Times Square as an urban place, and asks, how is a place full of movement different from a place to be still? Can you speak to that a little bit, either of you?
Well, I mean, obviously, when we designed it, we were very aware of the fact that it's not the same kind of space where you come and you stop and you look. Right. You're always moving through it, and you're moving through it. It's an American space. It's a space that's about the car as well as the pedestrian. And that's the sense of these signs that overlap one another, that you really always see things unfolding because you're constantly moving. And so I think that we were sensitive to that particular issue, and that is really one of the things that makes that space unique. There are many other spaces I alluded to too before in the city. If one wants to stop and look, you have opportunities. But this particular space is very much about movement.
Another questioner asks about Piccadilly Circus in London. Is it not undergoing similar signage and character changes and similar pressures to Times Square? And do you have any comments on that?
I understand. I think there's probably one or two signs left there now from what used to be. And it's unfortunate because everybody remembers those images of Piccadilly Circus, the night images of the signs.
Can you comment on two questioners asked about technology in terms of signage. One about lasers and whether lasers have real potential, and another about holograms in Times Square.
We've been looking with the signage manufacturers at different technology. All of it, by the way, comes from Japan now. And lasers are a possibility. Lasers have to project onto something in some medium where you can read the light beam, either through steam or heavy dust or smoke or something. And you have to be careful with lasers because if you look directly at them, they can blind you. So we didn't want to have a lot of blinded pigeons flying around, crashing into people at Times Square. But we are looking at that. The holograms, I don't think they've been done on a large scale at all.
Right.
They're always in a very controlled lighting situation. You have to have something that works in the day and the night too. So you have to have signs that are readable in the day, even in bright sunlight. And our site faces south, and there's a lot of bright sunlight. And then it changes and becomes visible at night too. And you see some of the Diamond Vision sign that was in Times Square on the east side was not very effective, not very readable.
Gone now.
Yeah. So all these things are being looked into, and hopefully we'll get some of it on our building.
Let's shift gears for the last few minutes that we have. One questioner asks if you could both please talk a little bit about your work in Asia and Africa.
Well, this is a long time ago. This is when Bangladesh wasn't Bangladesh yet.
But East Pakistan.
It was
right?
East Pakistan, and right out of graduate school, I went to Latin America and worked on the Alliance for Progress, Kennedy's program for building housing in Latin America, and then was in Nigeria for a while working on housing, and then John and I worked together in East Pakistan running a 50-person office there, doing university buildings. It was a company called Lewis Berger, one of these companies that no one ever hears of, but it has thousands of employees and is one of the largest architectural engineering firms in the world. And we had a wonderful time.
Financed by the CIA or something?
Part of it was, yes. We had to send reports back occasionally.
Right.
But as a matter of fact, some of the work in Latin America, we were building housing, and then there was another branch that was, doing other things. And but we were building housing there. Didn't know about that stuff. But in Bangladesh, we were doing a lot of university buildings, hospitals, schools, and it was a wonderful experience for two young people who didn't have any real practical office experience in this country.
Sure.
We worked there for 2 years and enjoyed it very much. Got a lot of things started. That's the only place I think where they build slower than the Transit Authority actually. So some of our projects are nearing completion, from what I understand. Then there was a war. John was on one side, I was on the other.
That's true. He went away for the weekend. He went to India, and I was in Pakistan, and the war broke out. We didn't see each other for a year.
Yeah, we were separated by the war.
That's
It
amazing.
was very sad. We were eventually reunited.
How were you, obviously, how were you reunited?
Well, the war ended, and I came home, and John met my ship, and we hugged, embraced. It was very
Waved to
touching.
the Statue of Liberty. And
Yes, exactly. No, after the war, we came
Bob
back.
had designed a great deal of glassware in Pakistan. It was a place where you could design
You were a
anything you wanted to have.
precursor of
in it.
Swid Powell.
Oh, it was
Yes.
wonderful. It was
Exactly.
wonderful stuff. And I packed it, except I packed it in a soft valise. And I'll never forget when it arrived. It was a valise full of
He
sand.
put all of my metal objects in a steel trunk, and the glass was in a canvas bag. So the Railway Express or whatever brought me this pile of sand. But you could, in those countries, you could walk into a factory, and because you were, at the time, an American, you could have them design anything you wanted and try it out, and it was a lot of fun.
I think in the year and a half that we were there, we designed something like 50 buildings. I mean, it was a wonderful opportunity. And in fact, we were in the city where Lou Kahn was doing the second capital,
sure,
which is in Dhaka, so his people were there. It was a very wonderful.
Must have been really a very rich time.
Yeah, it was terrific. And then we could obviously go to India and see Chandigarh and the work that Corbu had done in Ahmedabad, so it was very, very nice opportunity.
The interesting thing about a country like that, a lot of American architects were coming over, and it's a very humid country. It's very hot and humid all the time, and mold grows on everything. I mean, if you leave your pair of shoes overnight, the next day they're green and they have this odor. We still have books that smell from that. And I remember Paul Rudolph came over, and he was doing a building there, and when he first arrived, he was saying how wonderful the mold was and how how nice this sort of feeling was. And of course, the Pakistan people only wanted aluminum and shiny modern things. And after he'd been there and, put his shoes on the next day, before he left, he said, "How do I get rid of this goddamn mold on all these buildings?" And because that was the problem, you had to really work with the local materials, and use overhangs and things like that.
Beyond your own work, in terms of the things you saw in those years, you mentioned Chandigarh and Khan and so forth. What moved you the most? What was the most important things you saw?
Well, we had just come from studying. We were right out of school, and obviously Corbusier was a god. So you come with tremendous preconceptions, and then you go and see his work, was just extraordinary, very powerful work in both cities. So that work was, Khan's work wasn't done at that time. He was just starting his work. But I think Corbusier's work in India was fantastic, very, very powerful. And of course, some of the older things that you see were wonderful too.
Did you see the Lachin's buildings in New Delhi?
No, I wasn't in New Delhi. But I mean, I'm familiar with the work, but I hadn't seen any of that when we were there. I had gone through New Delhi.
Have you gone back to see the Khan work?
No, I'd like very much to do that.
You have not done much housing here, have you?
No, we worked on prefab housing. Remember Operation Breakthrough?
Oh, yeah.
Did you hear about that?
Sure.
George Romney, remember that?
Yeah.
We worked on Operation Breakthrough housing with a professor at Harvard who had developed a prefab system, and we did the architecture for him. We did a number of buildings out of that. Slightly more expensive than building regular construction.
Could that ever have
15% more.
Could that ever have changed or not?
Well, it turned out that everybody wanted to, thought that if you could build Fords, you could make 8 million Fords an hour and the price goes down per Ford.
Right.
Why can't you do that with housing? But it turned out that you needed a factory to do that. And the factory couldn't be further than a certain number of miles from the site. Otherwise, you had tremendous problems with transportation and expenses. And then you had labor unions. And then there's something very nice about building with things that you cut at the site and that you take up the slack and the variables of a construction site. When something's shipped to the site and it has to fit perfectly, it creates a lot of problems because things don't fit together perfectly.
Well, the codes, there are all kinds of things that suddenly compromise what you think is universally applicable, and then suddenly it's the first city you go into, you can't use it, so it's
of course, difficult. We do have a prefabricated housing industry. It's mobile homes. Is really what it is. It's just masquerading as something else in a way. A couple of final questions that change the tone just a little bit. One is, would you suggest that a son or daughter go to architecture school?
Well, that's interesting.
Maybe that's the one from your wife. I don't know.
She knows I wouldn't dare suggest anything to our daughter. Well, my daughter's here, and she and my other daughter's at Cornell, and they came to see me teach at Pratt a few times. And it's a difficult profession to make a living in, especially when you're starting out. And I remember coming to Pratt once, and they were at a jury, and I thought it was the most exciting class. And they sat there, and when we were leaving, they said, "Dad, is it always this boring? It's just terrible." And I didn't want them to be architects, so I said, "This is the most exciting class I've ever taught." And now my daughter at Cornell, I said, she has roommates. They're all architects. A lot of her friends are architects. And there's an aura about it. You can go to any college campus in the country, and we went to University of Virginia, and I was saying, look, at night, let's find the architecture school. Well, how do you do that? You just look for the building with the lights on. And there it is. You don't need a sign or a map or anything like that. They're dedicated to it. So I told my daughter the other day, why don't you consider switching into architecture? And she said, "Are you kidding after all you told me about it?" I said, "Well, it's not that bad, So I don't know. I would say, John and I both teach. And it's the kind of thing that the kid has to be very dedicated. I don't know if they have to have tremendous talent, but they have to love doing it, because the rewards are not as great as they would be if they were studying law or plumbing.
True. Well, plumbing is, a whole other world altogether. The great story about the doctor who I think I might have even told this here once. The doctor whose sink breaks, and he calls the plumber, and the plumber comes over and spends 15 minutes playing with it and gives the doctor a bill for $75. And the doctor says, $75 for 15 minutes work? That's more than I make as a doctor. And the plumber said, I know, it's more than I made when I was a doctor too. I guess because it's the last night of a series, we indulge ourselves a little bit, especially with the next question, which is just the sort I think I wouldn't have asked had you shown up on one of the first 4 of the 5 nights. Why is it that architects dress in so conservative a corporate style? Do you not wish to project a more artistic image?
Very good question. John and I, we very often dress very casually in the office, and we keep these suits in a closet. You see, with the ties, they're interchangeable. And it's like Superman. If we get a call from a client, we quickly go in and we're almost the same size.
This is his suit, as a matter of fact.
No wonder this partnership has lasted for 20 years. I see now why. Okay. John, do you have any sartorial comments to make?
Not beyond all the ones that we've made so far.
I think we'll end with this one. A 2-part question. If you could demolish one post-war building in the city, which one would you choose? And do you have any comment on New York City modernism versus postmodernism? You've got to at least answer the first half, even if you want to finesse the second half.
We're not big on postmodernism, to be honest with you, but I'm trying to reflect on the first one.
Demolish a building. Would we get to build a replacement?
We're feeling on the last night of 5 evenings very charitable, so of course you would. Even if you couldn't, what building would do the most? What building, the disappearance of which, would be the most beneficial thing to the urban landscape? It's all a very convoluted way of saying what post-war building bothers you the most.
Well, I don't think of a particular building. I think of the, quote, Avenue of the Americas in the 50s. And I remember what it was like before all those buildings went up, and it was very lively. There were restaurants and little shops. And then all these anonymous buildings went up, and you'll see an office with a green carpet and somebody sitting at a desk facing 6th Avenue on the street level, in this 40-foot high ceiling. And those buildings always annoy the hell out of me. That they just killed that street. So I would demolish all of that, the whole Avenue of the Americas.
John?
And we get that commission?
I'm not just doing one building, I'm doing a lot. It gives us a bigger chance to.
Well, Paul, yeah, it's an interesting point. There was an article, I guess, in the Times recently about architects liking particular buildings and which buildings they were fond of. And I share Bob's notions about the city as a collective. There's something about spaces in New York and the difference between a particular building and the quality of a particular place. For example, if you go downtown the Wall Street area, it's a very exciting area. And I sense it as a place rather than a building. A space that I like to be in that has a certain quality which is very rich and very identifiable. And so off the top of my head, I can't come up with an individual building that I feel particularly...
Well, the fundamental urban idea is that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, which I think is what you're saying. So maybe we can even rephrase this, take some license with that question and say, is there any area in which the whole has been more destroyed since in the last generation than another? I guess what Bob said is one.
Well, some of these mid-block buildings perhaps are questionable, where you get a block which has a certain amount of scale where the growth is at the avenues, and then suddenly in the middle of the block you'll get a building which is 20 or 30 or 40 stories high, which seems sort of in the sense of the bigger picture, it seems inappropriate.
Right.
Those are buildings.
You lost your 51st Street office to one of those buildings, as I remember.
That's correct, right? And that's not one of your greatest buildings either.
No.
I'd like to demolish that one.
And
now that you mention it.
Bring back the house that I remember your office was in years ago.
We were in the penthouse of a nice little building.
Beautiful sort of Beaux-Arts townhouse on 51st Street.
A long time ago.
Yeah. There's not only no such buildings left in that neighborhood, no architects left in that neighborhood anymore.
We've all moved downtown.
Right. Nobody but I.M. Pei left in Midtown, I guess, right? Exactly. Great. Well, thank you both very much for being here. Thank you all for being here tonight, another night. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.